On Power. Its Nature and the History of its Growth. Bertrand de Jouvenel. 1949. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Book 2. Origins of Power. The continuity of human development has been such that most, if not all, of the great institutions which still form the framework of civilized society have their roots in savagery, and have been handed down to us in these later days through countless generations, assuming new outward forms in the process of transmission, but remaining in their inmost core substantially unchanged. Fraser, The Early History of Kingship. Chapter 4. The Magical Origins of Power. 1. The classical conception, political authority the child of paternal authority. 2. The Iroquois period, the negation of the patriarchate. 3. The Australian period, the magical authority. 4. Fraser's theory, the sacrificial king. 5. The invisible government. 6. The rule of the magician elders. 7. The conservative character of magical power. To understand the nature of power, let us learn first how it was born, what it at first looked like, and by what means it got itself obeyed. This approach is, intellectually, a natural one, especially for the modern intelligence, which has been shaped by evolutionist thought. But the undertaking, once begun, is seen to be full of difficulties. The historian makes but a late appearance, in a society which is already highly developed. Thucydides is contemporary with Pericles, Livy with Augustus. The confidence due to him, so long as he deals with periods near his own and for which a whole variety of documents is available, is on a diminishing scale with every step he takes back to the city's founding. For those earlier periods his sources can be but oral traditions, these have, from generation to generation, suffered distortion, and his own version is that which suits his time. Thus it was with the myths of Romulus or Theseus. 18th century criticism, with its narrowly rationalist outlook, took them for poetical falsehoods. At the end of the 19th century, on the other hand, they were put under the microscope, and philology was brought in to help in elaborating ingenious interpretations of them, interpretations often fantastic and always dubious. Can archaeology help us? It has done an amazing work. It has unearthed buried cities and breathed life into forgotten civilizations. By its help, millenaries, which for our ancestors contained nothing but biblical characters, have been peopled with powerful monarchs, and the blank spaces in the map around the country of the Israelites have been filled in with mighty empires. But what the pick has revealed to us have been the blooms of civilizations which were like our own, stemming like ours from a millenary development. The gradually deciphered inscriptions are the codes and records of adult governments. And if below the layers of debris which attest wealth and power we dig to traces of a more primitive life, or if we turn the soil, Europe's is a poor one for the purpose, for indications of our own beginnings, what we find are clues only as to the way men lived and not as to how they were governed. We are left with one last resource, the ethnologist. Herodotus and Tacitus attest the fact that in all ages the civilized have been curious about the uncivilized. But, while enjoying the thrill of tall tales, it did not occur to them that they might be receiving in the process enlightenment about their own origins. They regarded travel stories as so many romances, the miraculous quality of which might be legitimately enhanced by the introduction of headless man and other bogies. The Jesuit Father Lafitau was perhaps the first man to bethink himself of looking for traces of the way we have traveled in the customs and practices of savages. Light, he thought, could be thrown on the process of social evolution by comparing what he had observed of the Iroquois Indians with what the Greeks had reported of the oldest folkways which had come down to them by tradition. It was only long after that the idea grew that primitive societies are in some degree retarded witnesses of our own processes of evolution. The first step was to recognize that all living organisms were related to each other and that the various species stemmed from a common trunk. This opinion, popularized as it had been by Darwin's book, was then boldly applied to social organisms. Search was made for the common trunk, the simplest type of primitive society, from which the various civilized societies developed, and the various savage societies were seen as so many stages on the road of a development along which every society known to history had passed. In the first flush of Darwinian enthusiasm no one doubted that the evolution of the clan into the parliamentary democracy could be traced as surely as the evolution of the ape into the man in a lounge suit. The discoveries and hypotheses of Lewis H. Morgan caused Engels to draw his pen. With it he told all in a treatise entitled The Origin of the Family, Property and the State. It is the fate of every science that, in the wake of the wonderful perspectives opened up by the earlier discoveries, the multitude of researches complicates and confuses the landscape. The daring and authoritative reconstructions of Durkheim are now derelict. It is no longer treated as proved that there was only one primitive society, Now, on the contrary, it is readily admitted that different groups of men have from the beginning presented different characteristics, which, as the case might be, either caused them to develop differently or prevented them from developing at all. The vogue of 50 years ago, of looking at Australia for the very archetype of a backward community and finding there the explanation of our religious feelings, has gone by the board. But such a flow of reason and research has not receded without leaving on the beach a considerable mass of materials. Let us see what we can pick up there. 1. The classical conception, political authority, the child of paternal authority. The first authority to enter our lives is the paternal. Must it not also be the first in the life of society? From antiquity down to the middle of the 19th century, all authorities have agreed in seeing the family as the first society, as the primary cell from which the social structure afterwards grew, and paternal authority as the first form of command and stay of all the others. The family is the natural society, said Aristotle, and cites in support some of the earliest writers. In it, said Carens, all eat from the same bread, all of them, said Epimedes of Crete, seek warmth at the same hearth. The most ancient of all societies, and the only natural one, is the family, asserts Rousseau, and Bonald too. Society was in the beginning family and then state. Everyone thought that society was an aggregation of families. The primary partnership made up of several households for the satisfaction of not mere daily needs is the village. The village, according to the most natural account, seems to be a colony from a household, formed of those whom some people speak of as fellow sucklings, sons and sons' sons. Over this assemblage, there is, again according to Aristotle, a natural ruler, for every household is under the royal rule of its eldest member. From this expanded family we arrive at the political society, which is reached by the same process of generation, for families, like men, reproduce themselves, until there is reached a family of families, over which the natural ruler is a sort of father of fathers. Bishop Filmer in his Patriarchy availed himself of this metaphor. Does not the Old Testament tell us that the children of Jacob lived together and made up a people? And while families grew into nations, the patriarchs took the form of kings. The other and quite opposite supposition is that the heads of the various patriarchal families met on a footing of equality and formed an association voluntarily. As Vico puts it, in the heroic state of society, the fathers were the absolute monarchs of their families. These monarchs, who were as between themselves naturally equal, made up the ruling assemblies and came, by a sort of instinctive feeling of self-preservation, to unite together their separate interests and link them to the hamlet which they called their country. According to which of these two hypotheses is adopted, the conclusion is reached that the natural government is either the monarchical or the senatorial. But from the time that Locke utterly smashed up Filmer's fragile structure, the earliest political authority was considered to be the Senate, composed of fathers of families, using the word families in the widest sense. Society must, therefore, have presented two degrees of authority, which were quite different in kind. On the one hand is the head of the family, exercising the most imperious sway over all who were within the family circle. On the other are the heads of families and council, taking decisions in concert, tied to each other only by consent, submitting only to what has been determined in common, and assembling their retainers, who have, outside themselves, neither law nor master, to execute their will. Here to hand is an illustration of the patriarchal family, from an example which has been thrown up by modern ethnology. Among the Samos of Utenga, the patriarchal family may be seen in its pure form. There, in fact, we find families of more than 100 souls living in the same abode around a common ancestor. All who live inside one of these vast quadrangular dwellings own the sway of the head of the family. He directs the labor and assures the livelihood of all who live under his roof. As it grows, the family splits off into separate dwellings in which a head of the dwelling holds acknowledged rule. Henceforward it is he who directs the work, but without derogation to the religious authority of a head of a family. The memory of their common origin survives with particular force among the Silmi Masis in the same region, who, though they number 5,627 in all, are divided up into no more than 12 large families. For practical purposes, no doubt, they are divided and subdivided into subfamilies and dwellings, but it is the head of the huge family who owns the ancestral dwelling. He it is who offers sacrifice for them all, and who is entitled to give in marriage all the female children, even though in practice he confines himself to approving what the heads of the subfamilies propose. What light, it may be thought, these observed instances throw on the possible nature of the Roman gens. How perfectly we now understand that a society so constituted had for its natural government the assembly of the tribal heads who enjoyed a sacred eminence, no doubt assisted by the more important heads of subfamilies. 2. The Iroquois period, the negation of the patriarchate. The classical conception of primitive society as resting on the patriarchate, which we have described, was rudely shattered round about 1860, almost concurrently with the Darwinian upheaval. This revolution I call here the Iroquois period, to mark the fact that its impetus came from the discovery made by a young American ethnologist, Morgan by name, who lived for several years among the Iroquois. After demonstrating to start with, what had already been observed by Le Fatau, that inheritance is with them maternal and not paternal, he noted next that their words for denoting the parents have a different connotation from ours, that with them the word father covers a paternal uncle as well, and the word mother a maternal aunt as well. At first he regarded these as mere peculiarities of the Iroquois, but, on finding the same phenomena occurring among other North American tribes, it occurred to him that he might be on the track of a family structure which was quite other than patriarchal. At the same time that, with the help of the Smithsonian Institution and even the federal government, he was conducting an inquiry into the words denoting family relationships in use in every society scattered over the face of the globe, a Bale professor published a remarkable book based on ancient Greek texts and monuments of antiquity. His point of departure was a passage of Herodotus. There is a curious law among the Lycians under which they take the name not of their father but of their mother. Ask a Lycian to what family he belongs, and he will answer you with the genealogy of his mother and her ancestors. The children of a free woman married to a slave are considered to be of noble rank, but if a male citizen, however illustrious his rank, marries a concubine or a foreigner, the children of the marriage are excluded from public honors. Bachofen, with inexhaustible patience, then got together a whole number of analogous indications derived from peoples of antiquity, with a view to demonstrating that the custom of the Lycians, so far from being an exception, was the relic of a general rule. In other words, the affiliation of a child must have been uterine. From every side there arose the idea that uterine affiliation preceded the paternal. A plethora of observations were soon to show it at work in a number of societies, in the form of the children of a marriage belonging not so much to the wife as to those who give the wife in marriage, viz., her father and, above all, her brothers. So that it would be more accurate to talk of avuncular inheritance. The fact of the same word parent denoting a whole group of people was taken to prove that marriage must have been by groups. For instance, my maternal uncle, or for that matter anyone else, is also my father because my mother must at one time have been as much as my father's, for the reason that she was in her time the wife of a whole series of brothers, or of a whole series of men. In the same way my maternal aunt is also my mother through having formed with her a part of a group of women who were in married intercourse with a group of men. And this phenomenon of group marriage has been seen actually operating among certain peoples. These were the two bases on which, once Morgan's great inquiry had been published, was founded more than one ambitious and hazardous reconstruction of the past history of human society. These reconstructions, built, destroyed, and reconstructed again as they were, stirred up researches from which one thing clearly emerged, that in a number of societies the family was not patriarchal, that the patriarchal family could not in consequence be the formative element of them all, and that therefore the paternal authority could not be the point of departure of every government. The way is now clear, therefore, for a new conception of the origins of power. 3. The Australian period, the magical authority. McLennan, in 1870, had been the first to observe that primitive groups have a cult of some particular plant or animal, it is their totem. On this observation of his, confirmed as it was by subsequent observation in Australia of the most primitive tribes of savages so far encountered, a new theory was erected. It is at root a conception, formed by observation, of primitive mentality. The reason why Vico could seriously imagine the fathers discussing matters of common interest and deliberately creating the fatherland, and why Rousseau could picture an assembly, deliberately and after a careful weighing of the advantages of liberty against the dangers of isolationism, concluding a social pact, was that in their time the nature of primitive man was shrouded in darkness. All is now changed, the plumed paladin and the naked philosopher, those 18th century hallucinations, have no existence for the ethnologist of today. The savage's body is, as he knows, exposed to such sufferings as through the organization of society we are spared. His soul is shaken by such terrors as would make our most horrible nightmares seem but passing dreams. The reaction of the human flock to all dangers and terrors is like that of animals, they gather closer, they curl themselves up, they give each other warmth. They find in numbers the principle of strength and safety for themselves. So far, then, from man having given willing adherence to the group, his very existence is only in and by the group. For this reason the severest punishment on him is banishment, which casts him out defenseless from his brothers to the mercy of men and beasts. The life of the group is, then, of a rigorously collective kind, and it is only by incessant vigilance that it maintains itself against the many dangers to it which are in nature. Death, disease, misfortune, all these are proofs of a pervading malignity. For the savage ascribes nothing to chance. Whatever evil befalls him comes of evil purpose, and a small misfortune is but a warning from this purpose of the approaching deployment of its full power. Therefore he must make haste to appease it with appeasing rites. Whatever comes, whether an exceptionally long winter exhausts the group's store of food or a torrid drought wipes out cattle and men alike, be it famine or epidemic or merely a child breaking its leg, nothing comes by chance. It follows that the appropriate behavior and ceremonies can forestall every misfortune. But who, except the elders, knows what must be done? And among the elders those only who have magical perceptions. Those, then, are the men to rule, for they alone can teach the way of coming to terms with the invisible powers. 4. Frasers' theory, the sacrificial king. Certain observed facts have given to this idea of the intercessory government a tremendous impetus. The king must have been, and if necessary the appropriate man must have had the office forced on him, someone who was qualified less to rule men's wills than to prevail upon the will of the invisible powers and secure their favor. His function was the appeasement of the evil purposes, if necessary by the sacrifice of himself in focusing them on his own person. It was also his business to encourage the forces of fertility. For instance, a very old song comes from Easter Island in which the growth and multiplication of potatoes, ferns, lobsters, and so on are ascribed to the virtue of the king. In winter there is a rigorous taboo on deep-sea fishing. When it starts again, the first tunnies to be caught must be brought to the king. Only after he has eaten them can the people use this source of food in safety. This widely spread custom of first fruits is very likely the mark of the mistrust felt in olden times for food which had not first been essayed. The king's action is that of a man who takes on himself the risk, then he says to his people, "Now you may eat." In some places, again, he must deflower the virgins, and the memory of this has been preserved in what history of the popular cereal type calls le droit de seigneur. There is no doubt that the act of deflowering passed for dangerous and was never, as the case of Australia shows, performed by the husband, rather it is the occasion of a rite in which other men render the wife harmless before she goes into her husband. Here too was the principle of kingly intercession. It does not strain the imagination to suppose that a king whose duties are to tame ceaselessly the evil powers, to replenish the number of good things and maintain at the same time the strength of the tribe, is likely to be put to death if he is a failure, or that any decline in his powers will be thought disadvantageous to his tribe. Thus, among the Shiluks of the Sudan, it is the duty of the king's wives to report any lowering of his virility, whereupon the now useless king lays his head on the knees of a virgin, and is buried alive with her. These facts are sufficient proof of the existence of magical kingships. They do not go the whole length of proving what Fraser thought could be proved, that kingship arises, and can only arise, on a basis of magical power. 5. The invisible government. The further ethnological studies go, the more certain it seems that primitive societies do not fall into any of our three categories: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Neither the behavior of individuals nor the action of the community is determined by either one man or several men or all the men. They are prescribed by powers which overarch society, which certain men are able to interpret for their fellows. We are given a picture of primitive peoples meeting in assemblies. But it takes an inflamed imagination to conceive of democracies of savages. It is a ludicrous error to suppose that meetings were held by the tribe for the purpose of debating the pros and cons of a particular course of action and that in the end the majority view prevailed. Their meetings were not deliberations at all, they were rather a species of black masses celebrated with the object of inducing the god to declare his will. Take the history of the least religious people the world has seen, the Romans. Even among them, as we read, sacrifice and the consultation of the auspices preceded the opening of a debate. To us in our time this practice appears only as the ceremonial prelude to a sitting. But it is certain that in the earliest times the Holocaust, and the examination and interpretation of the entrails, were the sitting. Its sacred character limited the assembly to certain times and places. G. Ulgome, an Englishman, said about discovering these places, these ancient assizes were, he found, always held out of doors, and a sacrificial stone stood in the middle of the gathering of the elders. These were the men who had exorcised the most evil of spirits and had qualified themselves the best to understand the sibylline responses of the god. We must picture the sacrificial stone in the gathering of the elders as forming the spiritual center from which political decision radiated, decision which wore the dress and carried the authority of a religious oracle. The elders, as the natural interpreters of the god, endowed him with their own attachment to ancient usages. Our distant ancestors were ever conscious of the miracle of equilibrium required for the continuance of life at all. It could be achieved only by the pious transmission of certain secrets. A priceless legacy indeed was the science of the metallurgist who first assured the tribe of an efficient armory, and precious were the rites which accompanied the forging of metal. Even the least emission from the ordained series of motions was hazardous. Humanity's march lay in those days across an unknown country strewn with ambushes. In one narrow path, to which the elders were the guides, was its security. That path it followed, in the elders' footsteps, fusing in one divinity and custom. An example given by Sumnermain shows how great is the repugnance felt by uncivilized peoples to government by deliberative decisions. While he was a civil servant in India, the government constructed irrigation channels with a view to providing the village communities with water. It was left to the communities to distribute the water. What happened? Once all was in train and the delicate task of apportionment had been done, the villagers decided to forget that a human authority had allotted to each his water. They persuaded themselves into the fictitious belief that their portions of additional water had been assigned them by a very ancient custom, at the back of which lay a primitive ordinance. If archaic societies felt like that, it is easy to understand the position held by the elders. Such is the strength of their authority in Melanesia that rivers actually saw them there cornering the women, with the result that one of the commonest marriages was between a grandson and the discarded wife of his paternal grandfather. Also, as he observed, a younger brother would, if his elder brother could find no better use for one of his granddaughters, marry her. Every act of life has its appropriate rite, and of those rites the elders are the repositories. The assurance of a good harvest lies not in the work of men's hands and in their manner of husbandry, but in the rites. The impregnation of the female is achieved not by the sexual act, but by the spirit of a dead man who enters into her and is born again as a child. Would any young man question the authority of the elders when, but for them, he would never attain manhood? Before he can be numbered among the warriors, he must submit to a rite of initiation. Sir Henry Sumner Maine, 1822–1888, English comparative jurist and historian, whose best-known work, Ancient Law, was published in 1861. His fundamental idea was to make patriarchal power the germ of society. At the hands of the elders. When the time has come, the adolescents are cut off, imprisoned, starved, beaten, then, the ordeal endured, they get the name of men. The adolescent well knows that, should the elders refuse him this name, he would remain a child forever. It is in fact from the name that there comes to him his share in the power infusing the group viewed as a single whole. 6. The rule of the magician elders. Among primitive peoples, the royal road to political rule is an understanding of the will of the occult powers and a knowledge of the times in which and the conditions under which they will be favorable. The elders are the natural repository of this branch of knowledge. But some are nearer to the gods than others, so near that they can even induce their actions. There is no question here of the divine will being moved by prayer, but rather, one might almost say, of its hand being forced by certain rites or incantations which obligate the god. All primitive peoples believed in the existence of this magical power. Take the Romans, the men who drafted the 12 tables included in them, even at that date, a prohibition against a man's lifting into his own field by magic the grain sown in another's. The Druids were credited by the Celts with the power of surrounding an army with a wall of air, that could be surmounted only at peril of immediate death. The evidence collected by Fraser proves that in various parts of the globe men have been deemed capable of either precipitating rain or checking its fall. Could anyone fail to base all his hopes and fears on those who wield powers like these? Or to desire above all things, if they are transmissible, to come by them? There lies the explanation of the amazing crop of secret societies among savages. The inner circle is formed by those of the elders who are most deeply versed in the occult sciences, and to them the whole tribe is subject. In the Bismarck archipelago, apparitions of the divine monster, called the Duk-Duk, awaken at intervals the state of religious panic which holds society together. Before any trace of the new moon's crescent can be seen, the women hide themselves, for they know that it is death to see the god. The men of the tribe gather on the shore, there to the beating of drums they raise their voices in song, as much to conceal their own fears as to do honor to the Duk-Duks. When dawn comes there are seen on the water 5 or 6 canoes, tied together to support a platform. Upon the platform flutter 2 10-foot-high beings. At the moment of this contraption coming to shore, the Duk-Duks jump forth onto the beach, whereat those present scatter in terror. Woe to the impious man who should touch these monsters, death by the tomahawk would be his fate. The Duk-Duks revolve around each other in a dance which they accompany with shrill cries. Thereafter they disappear into the undergrowth, where a house, crammed with presents, has been made ready for them. When evening comes they reappear, the one armed with staves and the other with a club. The men, drawn up in line, let themselves be beaten by them till blood is drawn and faintness supervenes, sometimes even to the death. Are the two elders who are dressed up as dukes aware that it is all an imposture? Do they do it for the sake of the natural advantages which thereby come to them, and to secure their rule over the society's life? Or do they really believe in the existence of the occult powers to which this play-acting of theirs gives sensible form? Who can tell? Do they know themselves? Whatever may be the answer, we have here a power, religious, social, and political, other than which these tribes have none. It is centered in these play-actors. Recruitment of the holders of this power takes place by a careful system of co-option. Entry into the various degrees leading to the office of duke cannot be hurried. A magic circle of the same sort, called the Egbo, has been found in West Africa. It is, say its finders, a degenerate one, because both entry and advancement are bought and sold. To rise by degrees to the innermost circle of the initiated costs and native sums which amount in stages to a total of £3,000 in all. And in that way the rule of the magician elders joins to its authority the forces of society. Then position is consolidated first by society's contributions in money, then by its support, and lastly by their depriving any potential opposition of the means wherewith to form itself. The rule exercised by the magical power is now a political rule, than which these primitive peoples know no other. Intimidation assures it the absolute submission of the women and children, blackmail gathers into it the whole of the collective resources of these communities. It imposes social discipline, it ensures observance of the oracular precepts which it gives forth, and of the judgments which it pronounces. All this it does by means of superstitious terror. So much so that superstition could be commended by Fraser as the wet nurse of the state. 7. The conservative character of magical power. Fear is the principle at the root of magical power. Its role in society is the fixation of customs. The savage who should turn aside from the practices of his ancestors would draw on himself the anger of the occult powers. But the more conformist he is, the more they work for him. That is not to say that magical power never innovates. The people may receive from it a new set of rules for the conduct of life, but these, once they have been promulgated, are integrated in the ancestral heritage. They are accorded, by a fiction which is characteristic of savage mentality, a special antiquity, and the new ways are no more called in question than the old. We may say that what power wins, it wins conservatively. All individual variations of behavior are checked, and society maintains itself in the same shape. To the group, magical power acts as a cohesive force for the preservation of acquired social characteristics. Before we leave it, let us note that the after-effects of a form of rule which must have endured for tens of thousands of years will not disappear with its fall. The peoples will still view innovation with a certain horror, they will still feel that uncustomary behavior calls down a divine punishment. The power which comes to replace the magical power will take over from it a certain religious prestige. It came down to us from the earliest times, this superstitious feeling which, taking on a new form, will ascribe to kings the power to heal scrofula or to calm epilepsy. So it is too with this fear, so often met with in history, of the royal person. It is tempting to suppose that, with the liquidation of monarchies, all religious association went out of a now depersonalized power. Very true it is that there is nothing holy about the people who now govern us. But our modes of feeling are more stubborn things than our modes of thinking, and we have transferred to the impersonal state some trace of our ancient reverence. There are philosophers who have given their minds to the phenomenon of disregard of laws and have sought out its causes. Much more surprising, however, is the opposite phenomenon of respect for laws and deference to authority. History never lacks instances to show us of vast masses of men submitting to a yoke which is hateful to them, and lending unanimous and willing aid to keep in being a power which they detest. The explanation of this strange veneration is in the unconscious worship which men still offer to the prestige of a remote titulary. And so disobedience, deliberate, proclaimed, and placarded disobedience, to the laws of the state has still about it something of a defiance hurled at the gods, and provides, too, a test of how great their power really is. Cortes threw down the idols on the island of Cozumel to prove to the natives, by his impunity, that their gods were false. When Hampden refused to pay ship money at Charles I's behest, his friends trembled for him, but his escape was proof that celestial thunderbolts were no longer wielded by the Stuart king. The king fell. Ransack the history of revolutions, and it will be found that every fall of a regime has been presaged by a defiance which went unpunished. It is as true today as it was 10,000 years ago that a power from which the magic virtue has gone out, falls. Power the most ancient has therefore bequeathed something to power the most modern. We have met for the first time with a phenomenon which will become clearer and clearer as we continue. However brutal the means by which new orderings of society take over from the old, the former bear forever the impress of the latter. Chapter 5. The Coming of the Warrior. 1. Social consequences of the warlike spirit. 2. War gives birth to the patriarchate. 3. The warrior aristocracy is also a plutocracy. 4. The government. 5. The king. 6. The state or public thing. 7. Kingship becomes monarchy. 8. The public thing without state apparatus. 9. Ancient republics. 10. Government by folkways. 11. Monarchical heritage of the modern state. There is no certain proof that our society once passed through the stage which any particular savage community is now seen to have reached. Progress is now no longer represented as a single road along which backward societies act as milestones. The present conception is, rather, of groups of human beings moving on towards civilization by roads which are quite different, with the result that most of them get held up in cul-de-sac in which either they stand still or, on occasion, perish. It would not be claimed today that totemism was a stage of religious and social organization which was traversed by every society without exception. On the contrary, there are, it seems, only certain regions of the earth to which it belongs. Nor is it true that uterine affiliation preceded everywhere the paternal. This line of thought is contradicted by the survival of uterine affiliation among some societies even after they have reached a relatively advanced stage of civilization, whereas in others the patriarchal family may be seen already achieved while they are still in a state of the crudest barbarism. The conclusion seems to be, then, that human societies, having made their appearance on the Earth's surface independently of one another, could from the start adopt different structures which have, perhaps, determined their future greatness or their undying mediocrity. What is certain is that those which, whether naturally or by their own efforts, were the first to be organized patriarchically, which were the least inclined to people the universe with evil purposes or freed themselves soonest from these fears, come before us as the real founders of states and as the truly historical societies. The extent to which exaggerated mystical fears inhibit every untried action and tend to block all innovation and all progress, needs no underlining, and it is certain that the patriarchal way of life favors social development as the avuncular certainly does not. The result in action of the latter is that the children of its young women become the property of a social group which cannot multiply except in proportion to its young women. Whereas in the former it is the children of its young men who become the group's property, and the rate of its growth greatly increases if these young men can, whether by war or in any other way, make a store of wives. Clearly then the patriarchal group will quickly become stronger than the avuncular, and at the same time more united. This has given rise to conjectures that some matriarchal societies had the patriarchal way of life thrust on them by their most powerful members, and that the group so formed swallowed up the others whom they ground into a proletarian powder. But, however different their social structures may have been, it seems certain that all primitive societies answer to our description of the ritual rule of the elders. Rule of that kind was necessary to guide men's uncertain footsteps past nature's ambushes. But, for society to take wing again, the old rule with its unchanging essence must be overthrown or, more accurately, discarded. What we may call the first political revolution was precisely that process. What was the cause of it? Beyond all question, war. 1. Social consequences of the warlike spirit. The hypotheses about the natural man formulated by both Hobbes and Rousseau are one and all rejected by anthropology. He is in fact neither so brutal nor so innocent as they made out. Indeed, within the limits of the small circle to which he belongs, he displays a good measure of sociability, though anyone, no doubt, who is outside his circle is a stranger, which is as much as to say an enemy. Is it, however, inevitable that societies living in isolation from one another should come to blows? Why should they? Their place is a small one on continents which are vast. Do peoples fight one another when they are living completely independent lives? Fichte thought not. And it is thought the creation by each nation of its own self-sufficiency was the royal road to perpetual peace. In the cold light of reason the conclusion is that the coexistence on the earth of various savage groupings does not necessarily result in either peace or war between them. What do we learn from the Central African and Central Australian fields of observation? What did our predecessors learn from the North American field? That some peoples are pacific and others bellicose. The fact is there, primary and irreducible, there are no circumstances to explain it. A people either has the will to power or it has not. The presence or absence of the will to power brings in its train vast consequences. Take the case of a pacific people. It renders respect and obedience to those who understand how to disarm and mollify the forces of nature, knowing that to them are due abundant harvests and multiplying cattle. But take on the contrary a bellicose people, which is less submissive to the decrees of nature. Violence will furnish it with whatever it lacks of women or cattle. we may be sure that there the first man in consideration is bound to be the warrior purveyor. All history is that of man's rebellion against his original state, of his efforts to secure for himself more goods than are within his immediate reach. One form, and an uncouth one, of this rebellion and effort is the foray. The same instinct, perhaps, in early times caused war and now induces global exploitation. Be that as it may, it is beyond doubt that the principal authors of material civilization are the peoples who are marked by the spirit of conquest. War is the cause, whatever else, of far-reaching social disturbances. Let us suppose that the elders of the tribe have celebrated all the rites and furnished the warriors with amulets which give immunity. The battle is then joined, and there now ensues a primitive form of scientific experiment. The strongest and the bravest proves the victor, not the man who carries the most charms. And before this harsh experience of reality the spurious reputations melt away. The man who returns in glory is the best warrior, his place in society will thenceforward be new and different. War is the overthrow of the established hierarchy. Consider the case of those Australian savages whose only form of wealth is their serving maids. So precious a commodity are women that they can be had only by barter. And so powerful and selfish are the elders that none but themselves may dispose of the girls of their hutment, whom they in fact barter, not for the benefit of the young men of their tribe, to get them wives, but purely for their own. Thus the number of their own concubines increases while the young men have to go without. To make matters worse, these ancients, fearing reprisals, do not allow the young men to go out on armed forays for women. The latter, therefore, have to do without women, and count themselves fortunate should they find some elderly female whom no one else wants any more, to maintain their fire, keep their drinking vessels full, and transport their luggage from camp to camp. Suppose now that a gang of these young men gets together and sets out on the warpath while the old men are palavering. The warriors return generously provided with wives, and their status, not only their material but their moral status, is at once transformed. If the foray leads to war, so much the better for them, for strong right arms will go up in price in times of peril, and the longer the war the more complete will be the displacement of authority. Honor to the combatants. The bravest become the most sought after and form an aristocracy. But we must not think of this process as a rapid one. Primitive military campaigns are brief and thinly scattered affairs. Between whiles the prestige of the elders picks up, and the cohesion of the warriors fails to hold. The course of events varies greatly according to whether the society is, or is not, patriarchal. If it is, then the sons' exploits profit the fathers by strengthening their credit. If it is not, then the opposition between the elders and the warriors becomes more sharply defined. The one is the party of obstruction, the other of movement. The one is for fossilizing the behavior of the tribe, the other for regenerating it by contact with the outside world. Where the elders grew rich by monopoly of the tribal wealth, the new aristocracy grows rich by pillage, that is its contribution to the community's life, and there perhaps lies the secret of its political triumph. The bravest are also the best placed for practicing the aristocratic duties of hospitality and largesse. Through the tribal feast they gain entry even into the secret societies and become their masters. They are, in a word, the parvenus of primitive societies. 2. War gives birth to the patriarchate. Even if the possibility of the patriarchate ever having been a primitive institution is not admitted, its rise is easily explained in terms of war. Agreed that, for natural reasons, in that the part of the father in the procreation of children was not at first understood, the child was universally the property of the male members of the mother's family. But there is no maternal family with which the victorious warriors, returning from a raid with a booty of women, have any account to settle. The children will be theirs, and their multiplication will bring them wealth and strength. And here is the explanation of the transition from the avuncular family to the paternal. The same explanation goes for the absolutist authority of the father. It comes, to put it shortly, from conquered women. And in that way war builds the bridge between one social regime and another. Notable philologists claim, moreover, to have found two strata of cults, the terrestrial cults of an agrarian and matriarchal society, later overlaid by the celestial cults of a warrior and patriarchal society. 3. The warrior aristocracy is also a plutocracy. We are in the region of guesswork. But what is certain is that, with the patriarchal family in being and war in progress, warlike courage becomes a principle of social distinction and a cause of social differentiation. War brings wealth and brings it in unequal shares. In a society of this kind, in what does wealth consist? Not in the land, for its extent is, relatively to the small population, almost infinite. To some extent, in food stocks, but these are soon exhausted. The important thing is to keep them continually replenished. In tools, certainly, but tools are no use without men to handle them. at a relatively advanced stage, in cattle, but animals need men to guard and take care of them. Wealth, then, consists in having a large labor force, wives at first, slaves later. War pays both these dividends, and pays them inevitably to the bravest fighters. It is they who come off best, it is they who have the largest families. The hero procreates on a scale which is in proportion to that of his successes. At a later date, after the institution of monogamy, losses in war tend to extinguish the breed of warriors. Our feudal nobility, for instance, is now extinct. Consequently, in our time, we have got used to seeing societies replenished by high birth rates among people of low position. But in earlier times the reverse was the case. It was the warrior families which multiplied. How many legends in how many languages tell us of the 100 sons of the gallant knight? To the natural channels of increase others were soon added. Primitive people are so acutely aware of the importance of numbers to strength and wealth that the first thing the Iroquois warriors do, on returning from an expedition, is to proclaim the number of their dead. The great thing is to replace them, and for that purpose use is made of the prisoners, who get incorporated into the families that have suffered losses. The practices of polygamy and adoption tip the balance strongly in favor of the clans which have one distinction in war. The weak and the flabby cannot breed at the same pace. They are but as dust against the mighty pyramidal structures of the clans, and constitute the lower and most isolated groups of men in society. Here we see, no doubt, the makings of the first plebs. All quarrels, other than those which arise inside a clan and do not affect the outside world, are caused by each of two families espousing in a clash the interests of its own members. It follows that these isolated or nearly isolated men, the weak and flabby, cannot indulge in them at all against a strong clan. Being in need of protection, they join on to some powerful group and become its clients. And so society becomes a federation of clans, of social pyramids of greater or lesser strength. The invention of slavery enriches them still further. Invention is the right word, for there is no doubt that more backward peoples had no conception of it. The idea of a stranger living among them had never entered their heads. If he could not be assimilated, adopted into a family, then his place was outside, and his fate was banishment or death. The first industrial revolution, comparable to the coming of the machines, took place when it occurred to men to spare the lives of their enemies and exploit their labor. Who owns the slaves? The victors, whose aristocracy thus becomes a plutocracy as well. And from that time wars will be carried on, or at least the essential parts in them will be taken, by this plutocracy alone. For wealth furnishes new munitions of war, such as the chariot, which only a rich man can make ready. They seem a different order of beings, the rich, fighting from their chariots, they are the nobles. So it was in the Greece of Homeric days. Besides the testimony of the poems themselves, Aristotle tells us that those were the times, both militarily and politically, of the cavalry. In this way war came to create a monopolistic caste of men who were at once wealthy, warlike, and politically powerful. The Romans called them the patricians, the Greeks the eupatrides. The rest of society formed up inside the cadres of the clans, so that it came to resemble a line of human pyramids. At the top of each is the chief of the clan, lower down are the clients, and at the bottom are the slaves. Each is a little state, in which the man on top is government, law, and justice. Each is also a citadel of religion, with its own cult. 4. The government. Society has grown. We are already far away from the primitive group which was, we are told, according to observations made in Australia, of a strength of from 50 to 200 persons under the authority of the elders. What we now have are swollen clans, each one of which may be as strong as a whole primitive group. What now hangs together is the great patriarchal family, and no longer what may be derisively called the primitive nation in miniature. But as between these families, what is the link? We find ourselves confronted at this point with the same data on the problem of government as confronted the classical writers. While failing to recognize the existence of a political prehistory, they made no mistake about the point of departure of political history. And we fall back, naturally enough, on their solutions, the Senate of the chiefs of clans, which is the confederative cement of society, and the king, who is its military symbol. Our brief excursion into the Dark Ages has, however, prepared us to appreciate that the nature of these governmental organs is not a simple one. It goes without saying that a chief for purposes of war there must be, and that his position is strengthened according as wars are frequent and his military success is unbroken. It is natural, too, that negotiations with foreigners should be conducted in the name of this redoubtable warrior, who, we may easily see, gets institutionalized to some extent and receives, while war is on, an absolute authority, the memory of which comes down to us from the Romans in the absolutism of the imperium extra muros. It is, moreover, logical to suppose that this chief, who in the ordinary way has at his disposition only the resources of his own clan, will have to reach agreement with the other chiefs of clans or be helpless, hence the necessity of the Senate. But it is impossible to regard any institution as a mere piece of working machinery. All of them stand charged at all times with an electricity which has been transmitted to them by the past, and which is kept alive by the feelings handed down to the present. So it would be wrong to regard the Senate as merely an administrative council in which each represents his own. It reproduces also some of the mystical characteristics of the Council of Magician Elders. Even more complex is the problem of the king. 5. The king. This problem is too vast for us to handle in detail, and we make no claim to hold the solution of it. There seems, roughly speaking, to be in kingship a fundamental dualism. Among certain peoples there are actually present, and among others there are traces of, two distinct personages, both of whom correspond generally to our idea of king. One is essentially a priest, officiating at the public ceremonies and conserving the strength and cohesion of the nation. The other is essentially chief freebooter, leader of forays, director of the nation's strength. It is noteworthy that kingship, as we understand it, is not the appanage of the warrior chief solely in virtue of that capacity. He is honored and saluted, he receives tribute of trapped game that he may, from his place of honor at the banquet, praise in return the skillful hunter, he is acknowledged to have a good eye for danger or opportunity, he calls together the council of state, but he is only a man among men. For him to be more than that there must be joined to his office of dux, as we may call it, the office of rex, which is religious in character. The rex is he in whom the ancient magical power and the ancient ritual office are subsumed and gathered up. At every point he is the slave of rigorous taboos. He cannot eat this, must not look at that, all about him is veneration, but his office is in truth precatory and expiatory, and himself but the prisoner and the victim of his mystic role. We glimpse dimly the dux usurping this place of honor. What he takes of it, however, are the prestige advantages which the position carries, not its shackles. There lies the explanation of the double character of the kingly power of history, a duality which it has transmitted to all succeeding powers. It is at once the symbol of the community, its mystical core, its cohesive force, its sustaining virtue. But it is also ambition for itself, the exploitation of society, the will to power, the use of the national resources for purposes of prestige and adventure. 6. The state or public thing. However it may be with these conjectures, it is sure that at a certain point of historical development we meet with the ambitious king who aims at extending his own prerogatives at the expense of the chiefs of clans, the absolute monarchs of their families, as Vico calls them, and is jealous of their independence. Inevitably the battle is joined. Among some peoples it is relatively easy to follow its course, and among them, as it happens, the kind's armament of mystical prestige is small. That is why, no doubt, he comes off second best in Greece and at Rome, but in the East the issue is far different. Let us examine first of all what is at stake. Without the chiefs of clans the king is powerless, since it is they alone who bring him the obedience of the groups which they control. The groups themselves are impervious to the royal authority. What is the objective of the king bound to be? To deprive the magnates of this solid basis of power, which forces him to bring them into the government, and then, having broken their ranks, to acquire for himself the direct control of all the forces of which they dispose. To carry out this program he seeks and receives the support of the plebeian horde which passes its uneventful life outside the proud pyramids of aristocracy. In some cases, too, he is helped by crushed and frustrated elements from within these pyramids. A victory for the king will be followed by a complete reclassification, by a newfound social independence for the humbler members of the community, and by the erection of a governmental machine which will make every individual directly amenable to power. A defeat for the king will put back the social reclassification, will save for the time being the social pyramids, and will place the direction of public affairs in the hands of the patricians, who will form an oligarchic republic. Mark this well, by its own inner logic the same impulse embarks power on two courses, the diminution of social inequality, and the raising and centralizing of public authority. 7. Kingship becomes monarchy. The chances of success for the royal purpose are least in a community which is relatively small, and in which the cohesion of the patrician classes is that much closer. But a society tends to grow, at first by confederation and later by conquest. We have the examples of Rome, Sparta, and the Iroquois to show us that confederation comes naturally enough to warrior peoples. The effect of confederation is to introduce into the newborn nation an element of heterogeneity, which gives the joint rulers, of whom there were two at Sparta, two among the Iroquois, and in early times two at Rome, a certain accrual of influence. Inevitably they are linked together, as when, at the start of a war, they celebrate the various rights of each constituent society. They are, as it were, the crystallizing factor in the mythological process, the factor which unites the cults and marries the gods of different societies. The societies of Greece and Rome, however, were not either large enough or heterogeneous enough or religious enough to provide the kings with a spiritual arm wherewith to assure their triumph. In the East, events are harder to discern. But it seems that there the kings were more obeyed, at first by reason of the accentuation of their religious character, and later by the sweep of their territorial conquests. When vast annexations of several societies are effected by a small conquering nation, the chief of the latter has always offered him a wonderful opportunity of absolutist power. Within the city's walls there was but a small population to hear his call to rise against the patricians, but the subject peoples, vanquished at a time when national sentiment was still unformed, can give him all the help he needs. One instance of this is Alexander, who formed a guard of young Persians when his Macedonians mutinied. Another is that of the Ottoman sultans, who recruited from the Christian peoples beneath their rule the corps of janissaries which brought them despotism at home and strength abroad. By means of conquest and of the openings which the diversity of the conquered gives him, the king can now shake off the aristocracy, of which till then he had been little more than the president. He turns monarch. Sometimes he turns more even than that. In the confused mass of conquerors and conquered, the cults of the different groups get confused, those cults which are in every group the privilege of a patrician elite. For to have relations with the gods is one way of securing their complicity, and there is no sharing out a private alliance of that kind. If, therefore, the king offers to the mass of his subjects a god for all, he is conferring on them an immense favor. The modern critic who thinks that the rulers of Egypt imposed on their humiliated subjects the cult of a god who was more or less themselves, is quite wrong. What happened was, on the contrary, that, basing themselves on the sentiments of their time, they gave the mass a newfound right and dignity, by including them with the nobles in a common cult. Such are the political and religious devices by which the monarch can erect a whole apparatus of stable and permanent government, complete with a bureaucracy, an army, a police, a tax code, and everything else which is connoted for us by the word state. 8. The public thing without state apparatus. The apparatus of a state is built by and for personal power. For the will of one man alone to be transmitted and exercised throughout a wide kingdom, transmission and execution must both be systematized and given the means of growth, in other words, bureaucracy, police, taxation. For monarchy, this state apparatus is the natural and necessary instrument. But on society, too, its influence down the centuries is so great that, when at long last the monarch has vanished without disturbing it, its motive power will still be conceived of only as one will, though it is now the will of an abstract person who has taken the monarch's place. The mind's eye will see, for instance, the nation deciding and the apparatus of state executing its decisions. Thinking thus, we find an ancient republic hard to understand, for there all action turns on a concourse of wills, whether the need is for decision or execution, and there is no state apparatus. It is remarkable that even such thinkers as Rousseau and Montesquieu should have lumped together modern states and ancient cities without marking the essential point of difference between them. The republic of old had no state apparatus. It needed no machinery for imposing the public will on all the citizens, who would have had none of such a thing. The citizens, with their own wills and their own resources, these latter small at first but continuously growing, decide by adjusting their wills and execute by pooling their resources. It is for this very reason, that everything turns on the adjustment of wills and the pooling of resources, that the ancient republic bears the name of public thing. 9. Ancient republics. We have seen how the king of a warlike society of clans could not take action without the help of the chiefs of clans, and we realize how natural it was for him to aim at concentrating all power in himself, a purpose which was bound to end in his breaking the power of the clans with the help of outsiders and plebeians of every kind, both native and captive. The clannish aristocracy suffers, inevitably, from a split mind. While seeking to maintain its status of near independence of, and near equality with, the king, it cherishes also the position of superiority and authority which it holds in relation to other elements in the community. Thus, Alexander's comrades in battle refused to prostrate themselves before him, while behaving with crushing arrogance to their latest victims in war and to their Greek associates. It is this frame of mind which must have set on foot the revolution which extinguished the monarchy in both Greece and Rome. To take these revolutions for egalitarian in the modern sense, as some have, is to show a profound ignorance of the social structure in ancient times. Their object was to hold in check two associated phenomena, the political elevation of the king and the social elevation of the plebs. This they did in the interests of a social hierarchy. We can see this clearly in the case of Sparta, a city which, more than any other, preserved its primitive characteristics and thus enables us the better to appreciate their essentially aristocratic nature. What a paradox it is that Sparta of all places should have received so much admiration from the men of the French Revolution. At Sparta there is nothing but the victorious warriors. These style themselves the equals, with reason, for their desire is to be equal with one another and with nobody else. Below them are the slaves who minister to them, the helots, who cultivate the fields for them, and the dwellers round, who are free but have no political rights. This social constitution is a typical one, and that of Rome in the early days of the Republic is just like it. The people has driven out the king. But people in those days meant exclusively the patricians, the men who belonged to the 30 curii, or groups of noble clans, groups which were represented as such in the Senate, the assembly of the fathers. Even the word patria connotes, as Vico has pointed out, the interests in common of the fathers and the noble families which they rule. 10. Government by Folkways. We do not find anywhere in the ancient republic a directing will so armed with its own weapons that it can use force. There were the consuls, I may be told. But to start with there were two of them, and it was an essential feature of the office that they could block one another's activities. On occasions when they wanted to impose their joint will, what means had they to hand? Only a few lictors. Right through her Republican period Rome never knew the means of public coercion and had for force only the people themselves, who could at need answer the summons of the leaders of society. Only those decisions were possible on which there was general agreement and, in the absence of any state apparatus, their execution depended solely on the cooperation of the public. The army was but the people in arms, and the revenues were but the sums gifted by the citizens, which could not have been raised except by voluntary subscriptions. There was not, to come down to the essential point, an administrative corps. In the city of old, no public office is found filled by a member of a permanent staff who holds his place from power. The method of appointment is election for a short period, usually a year, and often by the drawing of lots, which was called by Aristotle the true democratic method. It thus appears that the rulers do not form, as in our modern society, a coherent body which, from the minister of state down to the policeman, moves as one piece. On the contrary, the magistrates, great and small, discharge their duties in a way which verges on independence. How is a regime of this kind able to function at all? Only by great moral cohesion and the interavailability of private citizens for public office. A certain code of behavior had become so much second nature to the members of the community, thanks to the discipline of the home and the teaching of the school, and the code received such strong support from public opinion, that a mass of human beings became virtually indistinguishable. This happened especially at Sparta. Xenophon, in his Constitution of Sparta, stressed education above all else, as making for cohesion and a workable regime. The government of societies like this was, as has been truly said, the work of the Folkways. 11. Monarchical heritage of the modern state. The really decisive moment in the early history of a people is that of the crisis between the king and the chiefs of clans. It is then that, according to the issue of the conflict, differences in political character are formed such as will never be completely erased. Entanglement in constitutional theories of notions formed by contrary experiences, republic or state, citizen or subject, is due entirely to failure to appreciate the importance of this fork in the road. Whenever the chiefs of clans have won, the resulting political arrangements have been regarded as a society maintained jointly by the citizens for the advancement of their common interests, a res publica. The flesh and bones of this society are the individuals who make it up, and it takes visible form in their assemblies, the comitia. In time, those who were not of the society at first are promoted to membership and take part in its life, and with them the assemblies expand, the comitia centuriata and the comitia tributa. But when it is a case of opposing the whole of the community to an individual member or to a foreign community, then the title invoked is this concrete reality, the populace, and the interests which concern it, the res publica. No one speaks of the state, and there is no word to denote the existence of a fictional person separate from the body of citizens. If, on the other hand, the king wins, he becomes the man who is above all and rules all, supranus, sovrano. The members of society are so many subjects, subditi equals subjected. As in when the sovereign bids them, they lend in the aid of their resources, and the benefits which he brings them they enjoy. The community's focal point, its manifestation in the flesh, is the king on his throne. It is he who decides for and acts for the people, developing for this purpose an apparatus which consists solely of himself and his minions. Around this skeleton the flesh of society, its men, ranges itself. And the tie to which the community responds is one of a feeling, not of being associated in common, but of being possessed in common. Such is the manner of the formation of the complex idea, the state. The Republic, that is clearly we Roman citizens, looked at in the milieu of a society which we are forming for our common ends. The state, that is the sovereign commander of ourselves, who are its body servants. That in the end the king disappears in a political revolution makes no difference, for his work remains, that of a society formed about an apparatus which is society's master, never to be discarded. A natural result of the existence of this apparatus, and of the relations established between it and the subjects, is that the modern man can never know citizenship in the ancient sense, when each decision and its execution was the work of all, when all took an active share in every side of public activity. True it is that every 4 years democracy will put him on a throne and give him the right of dispensing place and orientating policy, but the fact remains that for the rest of the time he is the subject of the apparatus which, if it is any consolation, he has helped to set going. We see then that the monarchical period established in the body of society a distinct organ. This was power, which has its own life, its own interests, its own characteristics, its own ends. It needs studying under this aspect.